Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. This is Chapter 7. This is Professor Roundtree. And in this chapter, we're going to talk essentially about marketing, segmentation, targeting, and positioning. Now, if there is a concept that you take away from this course that you never, ever forget, even if you are not a marketing person, it's understanding the importance and relevance of segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So we'll talk about what market segmentation is, how it ties into targeting, and then we'll kind of close it out by talking about what is differentiation and how that ties into positioning our product in the marketplace, which essentially is in the minds of consumers. So when we think about segmentation, the ultimate goal for segmentation, targeting, and positioning is to create some sort of value for a target market. So the long and the short of it is, if we can create an offering for an individual person who is part of a segment that is more customized for their particular needs, then they should experience more value in terms of benefits relative to a certain cost that they're actually paying for. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each of these one at a time. Segmentation basically divides the market into smaller segments. Targeting is actually selecting a segment or segments and going after them. Differentiation is how are we different in terms of what we offer compared to competitors. And then lastly, positioning is again, it's a concept in the minds of consumers. Remember, it has nothing to do with positioning, physical positioning, for example, on the shelf in a store. It's about, and we'll talk about perceptual mapping, it's about how the consumer organizes your brand relative to other brands in their minds. It's all in their minds. So market segmentation is dividing a market into smaller segments, smaller groups, which have a distinct need. Now, one of the key assumptions here is that if we have, let's say, 4 segments, the key assumption is that the people who are in each of those individual segments have something in common. But also what we have to assume too is that there are some differences across all 4 segments. So for example, if there is no difference across all 4 segments, there is no segmentation. And if the people who are in each segment don't have something in common, and we'll talk about all these different ways that we can segment markets, if they don't have something underlying in common, then we don't have a segment. Now, while we're going to focus mainly on consumer markets, segmentation is also important for business markets as well. Dell does a really good job at that, where they focus on, for example, the government market. There's a separate segment for nonprofits, which would include schools, hospitals, and the like. And then they have their corporate segment, and some of those are small business oriented, and some are even intermediate and very large national and global companies. And then we'll talk about what are some of the requirements for effective segmentation. Now, we can segment markets using a lot of different variables, or what we might call descriptors, and we'll take them one at a time. We think about geography, we're talking about physical location. So it could be segmentation based on geography, east versus west, north versus south. It can be rural versus urban, suburban. And so when we think about segmenting markets, it's about where the customers physically live and or are located. Demographics, on the other hand, are these descriptors that describe individuals. And I'm going to move on here. Demographics are descriptors of individuals, and it can be things like age, gender, family size, income, occupation, education. If you notice, all these things are more things that describe people and their group. Many people choose to use demographic segmentation at the exclusion of all sorts of other ways to segment markets. I call this lazy segmentation. And one of the things that you'll find, and I'll repeat this many times in this course, you get a much richer segmentation of the marketplace if you use something other than how you describe people. So describing them based on their behaviors and their lifestyles give you better information, or life stage gives you better information about who these folks really are and what their underlying needs are and how to motivate them to buy and prefer your product over some competitor. So as I was saying, age and life segmentation, that typically gets at more so a numerical number. And I think I might have mentioned this in chapter 5 as well. Life stage is really important as people get older. And one of the things that we'll find is that as people get older, they may continue to share the same age group. So for example, you guys are about 22 years of age. You probably share a lot more right now in life stage. Most of you are probably single without children. Fast forward 20 years from now, when you're in your early 40s, you're going to still share that age bracket, but what might happen is people will then splinter off into different subsegments based on life stage. And so we'll find some folks who are married with children, some people are single with children, some people who are divorced, some people who are single and never married. All those are different life stage issues, and the products and services that they require at that point in different stages might be very different. So when we look at a group of people who are college graduates, class of 2014 as an example, 20 years from now in 2034, we're going to find that yes, you all still share the same age, but you may be very different in terms of where you are in your life stage. Gender segmentation, very simple, straightforward. Again, it's self-identification. So male, female, and then we might even have an other category. But it's important to know that generally when we talk about these boxes, and think of them as boxes people check on a survey, again, it's not very rich information, but it's very good information to have. You can segment people based on their income levels. You can talk about them in terms of the income that they create, maybe the way in which they earn their income. So for example, someone who is on salary versus salary plus bonus, somebody who might be on a bonus versus profit sharing, absolute income level, retirement level income, social security income. So income is a very important descriptor because it tells us what kind of purchasing power one might potentially have. Also, too, one of the things that you don't get in things like income is maybe people's ability to actually go out and borrow in the marketplace. So you might even throw credit rating in there as an example in a different type of category. Psychographic segmentation, it talks about buyers and it talks about more lifestyle, their personalities, their social class, all these things that kind of describe what they do and who they are, rather than just describing them in a particular checkbox kind of category. We could also break them down based on their behaviors. And some of those behaviors can talk about their knowledge, their attitude, their uses, their responses. So for example, we can segment technology users based on their knowledge level. And so you may have high knowledge users, low knowledge users, and maybe even a user group that's somewhere in the middle. Or if we're looking at people and their pattern of usage and association, we might have high users versus low users. As an example, whenever they talk about smokers or drinkers, they talk about heavy drinkers or light drinkers, moderate drinkers or social drinkers, social smokers versus non-smokers. And so it's just a way of trying to understand in a particular category based on a behavior as far as the usage level, and figuring out whether or not it makes any difference when it comes to targeting them. You could also look at things like loyalty status. So for example, if you happen to be an airline company and you might segment your market into those who are part of your loyalty program and those who are not. Even those who are in your loyalty program, you can further sub-segment them in terms of level of loyalty. People who have been in your program for 10 years, or maybe they've taken flights that exceed a certain amount of mileage. So different ways that you can look at it based on people's actual behaviors. Generally, when we think about markets and market segmentation, again, I think the important point is to have a cross-section of multiple ways to slice and dice the pie. So figuring out as much as you can the best way to describe groups of people to see what they have in common in a particular group, but also too, what things distinguish and differentiate that group from other groups. And so the more ways you can slice and dice the pie, rather than just having those checkbox categories where we start getting into behaviors and lifestyle issues, we have a better chance at understanding what is going on in their daily life in terms of how they live. We could also segment international markets. American Express does a really good job at this. We could segment markets as it relates to economic wellness, as an example. Maybe their GNP or GDP, the physical location of people in different countries. It could be Europe versus Africa, North America versus South America. Looking at the political and legal situation. Some of it might be you could have stable countries versus unstable countries. A lot of times you hear things like third world countries. I don't necessarily like that particular phrase, but you have to figure a way how to describe certain political structures versus another. So communist versus capitalism. Even within capitalism, you have some that are viewed to be more socialist if we look at, for example, France compared to the United States. Cultural factors, it's all those things that impact how you could potentially do business with them. There are some countries where bribery is legal. And so doing business in one country, you might be able to engage in that kind of behavior, assuming you don't break current U.S. laws. I think generally speaking, the U.S. government frowns upon American companies bribing other companies, even if that is legal in that host country. We also want to think about this concept called intermarket segmentation, which divides consumers into groups with similar needs, even though they're located in different countries. I always say if you look at, for example, the lifestyle issues, that's really where you're able to really kind of cross geographic boundaries, because the geographic boundaries don't mean as much. So, for example, a 22-year-old college student in the United States probably has a lot more in common with a 22-year-old college student in Germany than either one of those have with a 42-year-old who lives in their same country. So it's really about thinking about geography as maybe one layer that you could use, and that layer might be most important when we get to some of the criteria in terms of being able to reach a segment, which kind of talks about that issue right now. So when we think about a segmentation strategy and we have to figure out how to segment the market, how to slice and dice the pie, the question always will be, how do we know we're being effective when we decide to go target a particular segment? So one, the segment has to be measurable, meaning you have to be able to quantify a segment in terms of purchasing power as well as number of people who belong to that segment. They should be accessible. So if they're a segment, a good effective segmentation strategy takes into account whether or not you can service that particular segment within their location. So for example, if you owned a dry cleaning service and you said, well, I'm going to try to see if I can service, let's say, London, England. And if for some reason you say, I don't really have the wherewithal to open up a store in London, England, obviously that particular market of people, regardless of what their needs are for dry cleaning, it's not accessible to you. Okay? Or if you're looking to do tax services and there is a physical proximity component to the service that you deliver, it may not make sense to actually be able to reach that segment in a different country. With physical products, a little bit more difficult to do across geographic boundaries, not impossible. It can be done relatively easily, actually, with the right amount of resources. But with digital products and services, if you wanted to open a bookseller online, it doesn't matter geography, because you can access anybody in the world as long as you have access to the delivery system through FedEx, UPS, or any delivery service in the host country that needs to deliver the product physically. If it's digital, all you have to do is have a strong internet connection and you'll be fine. The market should be substantial, meaning that there are enough people there where it really makes sense. Unless we're talking about selling jets or yachts, having a segment that has, only 3 people in it, or 4 people, or 10 people, it might not make sense. If you're talking about jets, that might be a large enough segment because the amount of money that you would be generating revenue-wise is substantial with that. There should be some point of differentiation. Each segment, I think I mentioned this earlier, each segment should be different from the other segments. If they're not different from other segments, they're not truly different segments and you have not engaged in any segmentation. And then it should be actionable, meaning you should be able to have the resources to go after those segments. I mean, the reality might be you're a startup company, and if you think you're trying to compete with the current manufacturers of automobiles, that's probably not going to be an attainable goal. So segmenting the marketplace in terms of people who need transportation with regard to automobiles may not be something that would be in your wheelhouse, at least at this point, because you don't have manufacturing facilities. So all these things here really kind of speak to the issue of, are we having an effective segmentation of the marketplace? So if we can't measure these different segments and figure out how large they are, and if we do figure out how large they are, if it's not substantial or large enough, and if we can't access them to be able to service them, whatever we sell product or service wise, and if we can't figure out a way to differentiate each of these segments and have an action that would enable us to target them. And we're going to talk about targeting next. And targeting basically means that we look at a segment and then we decide which ones we want to go after to sell our products and services. So we put together a differentiated market plan where we create a product, we price it accordingly, we distribute it, and we promote it in a way that's different for that particular segment or customized for that segment. So anytime we talk about targeting a market segment, it's putting together a marketing program, again, the P's, executing our strategies to go after that particular segment or segments. So we're thinking about targeting here, the segment size and growth. Obviously, we have to look at the segment itself in terms of the size and the growth. If it's worth our time, it's probably going to be something that has high growth potential in it. And also to the size of the segment that we're looking to go after currently has enough people who are able to and willing to buy our product or service. And the structure of the segment should be attractive. It shouldn't be saturated with a lot of competitors where everyone has a very, very small proportion of the consumers there. So you don't want to have, for example, 1,000 customers in such a small segment, and then you have 10,000 people who are competing with you. There's just not enough business to go around. And also, too, it should fit into what your company's objectives and resources are. So you should be able to say, we have the resources to target them. Do we have the salespeople to send over to London if we're targeting someone in London or Germany? Do we have the salespeople to go out to California if we're based in New York or New Jersey? So all those questions have to be answered before we figure out whether or not we should be targeting a particular market segment. And there are several different target market strategies. The first one we're going to talk about is this undifferentiated strategy. So when we think about something that is undifferentiated, we're saying we're essentially going after the whole market. I'd probably say this is less common today because there's so many different ways to segment markets and to be able to access them in a way that's beneficial. Because if you don't have any segmentation strategy, you may hear this, especially from entrepreneurs. You ask them who the target market is, and they say our product or service is for everybody. If you're trying to create a product for everybody, you're creating a product for nobody. So always think about that. So kind of focus on whatever those common needs are within a particular market, but the odds are you're not going to create a mass market strategy. Everything, for the most part, is about niching and coming up with a particular niche market. The general way that most companies manage their brands is they try to come up with something that differentiates them from others who are trying to satisfy the same need. And so we want to be able to generate additional sales, potentially grow the market, and at some point have a large enough proportion of users prefer our brand over other competitors because we essentially do it better. Our benefits might be better or perceived to be better. Our pricing structure may be better because we control our costs better, or we manufacture in a way that's more cost efficient. So when we think about things that are more expensive, as an example, um, being more expensive doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to stand out in the marketplace unless you offer the commensurate level of additional benefits. Now, when we think about concentrated marketing, typically this is what many companies do. They pick off a niche in a particular marketplace and they concentrate on it. So, for example, you may decide that if you wanted to start a search engine today, obviously you're not going to try to create what we would call this mass market search engine to compete directly with Bing or Google or a few of the others that are out there. You may want to create a search engine that focuses on one specific segment of the marketplace. So say, for example, you said, I want to create a search engine for all those things that are important to college students. And so that might be your point of differentiation. Not saying it's an easy task, but at least you can focus on one particular niche of the market and concentrate on them, satisfying those needs and providing something of value to them in a way that's effective and efficient. Another strategy that we typically talk about is this whole micro marketing strategy. Now, the internet and geolocation that's available on mobile devices has made this even more important. You might hear the term local marketing or individual marketing. All these things are more micro marketing, micro targeting. You might even hear that phrase as well. And so there we're talking about using all the uniqueness of a physical location to try to provide a unique bundle of benefits for consumers. So, for example, many internet companies, for example, Groupon built its business based on this micro marketing strategy. Most of the, especially the original one, not the Groupon goods or products, but it's really the services, the nail salons, the restaurants, all those things were micro marketed to local merchants and local people who lived in the cities where those merchants did business. And so they never sold a Groupon necessarily, may have, but most of the Groupons were not national Groupons. They were very much localized. And so it had a local feel, a local flavor to it. And so they looked at that as an opportunity to use technology to segment the market using geography, and then we can overlay that with other benefits that people are looking for and other ways to describe them. But the bottom line is we're looking at segments of the marketplace that are primarily segmented based on geolocation and small individual markets locally. So I think I've already covered this here. So local marketing, I think, is always going to be important. But the internet and geolocation with our mobile devices has really made it a lot easier for people to engage in that type of marketing. This individual marketing, more customization, you see that in a lot of ways when it comes to products and services that can be easily customized. I'll give you an example. There's a manufacturer of bicycles out in, I believe it's Ohio, who manufactures bicycles, and they create more of a customized solution. So they take your measurements. You can do it all online. You have to measure yourself, but they'll take your measurements and they will actually outfit you with a bike given all the types of materials. If you want titanium, you can have that. You can customize your brakes, your handlebars, your wheels, all that kind of stuff. But the frame is physically customized based on your particular size and height and weight and all those types of things. But one of the things that they realized, though, is that while that was great, they could physically make a bike customized in a day. But one of the things that they realized to actually deliver the value that customers wanted, most customers didn't believe they could get a customized solution in one day. So what they did was they made the bike in one day, but it sat on the shelf in the warehouse for about a week to 10 days, and they made the delivery. So again, it's trying to give this one-on-one solution, but having a perception that a custom solution is truly custom and not just off the shelf. And so sometimes maybe taking longer than you actually need to get it done might be a good way to communicate that. So how do you actually choose a target market? I think, a lot of it has to do with your resources. It has to do with the competitive landscape. It has to do with how much variety in terms of the products or services that you sell. It depends on the product life cycle of your particular product. So for example, if you have a product that's in the decline stage of the product life cycle, meaning over time your sales have declined, maybe you need to reposition that particular product and go after a different market. I think I may have given this example in class. And there's a brand called Pierre Cardin that's been around for the longest time. It's been around ever since Calvin Klein and some of the well-known brands that are still doing well today. But they didn't manage that brand very well. And so now it is really in the decline stage of the product life cycle. And so the segments that they typically go after now are those value-oriented segments. So people who are looking for inexpensive alternatives. So that's why you can find their cologne and their clothing in Burlington Coat Factory. You can find them in, let's say for their cologne, a CVS or a Walgreens. So it used to be a very premium brand, but now it's not a premium brand. So it's been repositioned as more of a value-oriented brand. And so for them, the segments that connect directly with value orientation typically are going to be those that are income specific. So those folks who have less disposable income, maybe less access to credit because of the price point of what they have. Now, when we think about companies who are socially responsible, we've seen some negative issues with regard to certain types of product categories, alcohol, tobacco, and so on, where they have been targeting segments that are not deemed to be socially acceptable. So, for example, the whole Joe Camel campaign that they were using for little children, where they'd have the billboards right near schools all around the country. Joe Camel is a character that Camel, the cigarette brand, was using to try to connect with potential smokers or current smokers. But what they found was that the kids thought that the camel was really cute. And so with Joe Camel being so cute, there are some kids who began picking up the habit of smoking at a relatively early age. So when we think about segmentation and who you go and target, especially if we're talking about children or people who are what we call vulnerable populations, companies have to be very cognizant in terms of how they might be perceived in the marketplace, as well as actually breaking some laws. So once we decide that we want to target a particular segment of the marketplace, we're going to talk a few minutes here about what this whole notion of product positioning is. So it's the way a product is defined by consumers on important attributes. So again, the important point here is a place in the consumer's minds. It has nothing to do with where the product physically is positioned. So it's how they're positioned in the consumer's minds based on their perceptions, their impressions about the products relative to one another. Again, it's relative to other competitive offerings and how they feel about a particular product. Much of this stuff is driven by marketing activities and people's interaction with the various products. This is an example of a perceptual map. Perceptual maps have been used for, couple of decades at least, several decades at least. And what it does is you do it by collecting data based on people's perceptions of some dimensions. Here we're talking about automobiles, luxury orientation versus performance. How do they view a brand as being luxurious or performance based? And then we overlay that with the cost, the perceptions of the cost. And so what we're trying to do here is try to figure out collectively, and once we collect the data where we're asking them to essentially go ahead and rank all these particular brands here that are related to the target group. So Escalade, the Hummer, Infiniti, the Range Rover, and so on. And what we do is we take their collective responses to it in terms of how they would rank Escalade versus Range Rover on luxury versus performance, we'll see that there might be some differences. Where you can use these particular maps, that's really important, is if you want to find out what people think about your brand relative to other competitors, and then you ask yourself the question, do I like where I am being perceived on the map? And if I don't, where is there an unoccupied space on that map where I could move my brand to? Yeah, sorry, let me just go back here for a second. So for example, we might say, let's see, this little green one here is Hummer H2. We may think that we'd like the Hummer to be positioned in the minds of the consumers a little bit more of a performance brand, and so we want to kind of shift this over somewhere along here. And maybe we might say at that point we might have to, add additional cost to it. So we want to move the Hummer brand here, from here to over here. And so then you ask yourself the question, how do we accomplish that? So maybe it might be in the engineering. So you're changing the product P. Maybe it is already a performance-based vehicle, but people just aren't aware of it. So maybe you need to use advertising to communicate that issue. Maybe the price of the car and all the attributes and features that you have aren't consistent with a performance-based brand. So maybe you have to revamp that as well. And so, again, the key point here is to see where you sit and then figure out whether or not you like where you are. If you want to move, you got to figure out what strategy you need to execute to get that done. Another way you can use Perceptual Map is to say we have a new vehicle that's coming into the marketplace. And you ask yourself the question, where is there a space in the collective mindset of consumers where there is a competitive opening? So right now, there's definitely, if we're looking at, let's say, under $80,000, if you can get a vehicle to be around $80,000 and be perceived as more of a performance brand, that's a space that's not currently occupied in the consumer's collective mindset. So how do we figure out and determine how our positioning is? First, we identify a set of possible competitive advantages to build a positioning on. And then we have to choose the right competitive advantage. So the right competitive advantage might be being perceived as a performance-based vehicle that is under the $80,000 mark, but also too is a four-door, very large SUV vehicle. And so then we select an overall positioning strategy. Again, the example that I gave, maybe we want to be perceived as more performance-based. And then the question, after you figure out what you want to be and who you want to be, the question is, how do you deliver on that? So which P's do you use? Maybe it is a combination of changing the product and changing people's perceptions of the product. Again, relative to all the others that are out there. Concept we're all familiar with. The important point here is we want to deliver the most value that we possibly can to our consumers in a way that's different from our competitors. And then we're winding up here real quickly. So when we're choosing a differentiation strategy here, we want to identify a set of possible competitive advantages to build by providing superior value. And so the whole point is, how do we deliver on that? Are we delivering a differentiated product? And think about the car market. Is it superior strategy? Do we have some competitive advantage in the distribution channel? Meaning, let's say, for example, we have real estate holdings. If we happen to be McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's, we have real estate holdings that are in locations that are being developed or redeveloped. And so that might be a competitive advantage because we have and hold leases, or we own the property in areas where they are building up, and our competitors don't have that. So it may be a channel issue. Maybe we just do things better in terms of the people interactions. Southwest has for the longest time been positioned as a different airline because they're more of a fun place to actually fly. And so if you believe that it's a good place to be, you have to train your people accordingly. So when they interact with the flying public, they kind of deliver on that message. And so maybe it might be a people strategy. Maybe it's just about advertising in the image. So sometimes people just know who they really are. I mean, I love actually this easy button. I love it.
That was easy.
That was easy. I mean, that little thing here, that was easy, is something that they put in most of their commercials these days. What they're trying to communicate there is not only do we have all the answers to your solutions or solutions to all your problems and answers to your problems, when you come in, they make it very seamless for you to do business with them at a fair price. So when we think about differences actually should, be very important. You should communicate them. It needs to be preemptive, meaning if you want to occupy a space in the consumer's collective mindset, you need to get there first. Like we saw in that perceptual map, there was a lot of cluttering going on there. And so once you see a lot of clutter, that means that consumers don't really see a whole lot of difference across brands. Not really good for any individual brand. So you want to make it distinct, perceived as superior in what you're offering, but also too, it has to be value oriented relative to the category. So it means that for whatever the benefits are, it has to be at a price that people see some value. Now there's a concept called a value proposition, which is the first things, for example, that an investor will ask an entrepreneur. What's your value proposition? Meaning, what's the benefit that you're providing for your particular product in the marketplace relative to your competitors? And so it really should be, is it based on price? Are your benefits different? Remember, when we think about value, it's some sort of balance and combination between benefits, quality, you'll call those in the same category. Think about it as a scale, balancing scale, relative to cost. And the cost could be monetary and non-monetary. So everybody wants to be perceived to deliver the greater value. And that greater value can be delivered in a couple of ways. For a given level of benefits that everybody offers, you're cheaper. If everybody offers the product at a similar competitive price, you're offering more benefits relative to the same price. So to kind of sum up here, we think about target, again, STP, segmentation, targeting, positioning. We want to target segments that have an unmet need, and hopefully that unmet need can be met by our particular brand in a way that's very different from the way anybody else can solve that problem. And the way you communicate that is with your physical product strategy, your promotion strategy, your pricing strategy, and your distribution strategy. And if we're talking about a service, you got to think about the people interaction and the process that goes on in delivering superior value. Because at the end of the day, we may not sit there as consumers and do this calculation, but we do start to think about it when we believe we're paying more for what we're getting. And finally, it's a lot easier to see where you want to be. The difficult part is implementing it and getting it there and staying there. And so that's really where a marketer does a great job. Perceptual maps are great to show the open holes where there's an opportunity, like we were talking about with the Hummer. But the question is, how do you strategically move people's perceptions to that open space that's unoccupied, that is valued? Anyway, so that finishes up STP Chapter 7. And so I will see you in the next chapter, Chapter 8.